Hey everybody, welcome to a video on the conjunction and disjunction fallacies. We're going to take these fallacies in turn, first discussing the conjunction fallacy, and then we'll discuss the disjunction fallacy. So the conjunction fallacy refers to the common tendency of humans to overestimate the likelihood of conjunctions, right? Remember, a conjunction is an and statement, especially relative to their component conjuncts. So the classic example of humans committing the conjunction fallacy is what's known as the Linda problem. And this is a problem that came out in a paper in the early 1980s from Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. And they basically gave people a description of this woman named Linda. The description went like this. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Okay, so we have this description of Linda as a social activist. And then we're asked, what is more probable? That Linda is a bank teller, or that Linda is a feminist and a bank teller? Right? So the Kahneman and Tversky asked people this question. Which one was more probable? We could think of this in terms of inductive probability of arguments if we view the L as a proposition specifying Linda's characteristics, that she's a social activist and so on. B is the proposition she's a bank teller, and F is the proposition she's a feminist. Then what we want to know is which of these two arguments has greater inductive probability. The first one, that just reasons from L to Linda being a bank teller, or the second one that reasons from L to Linda being a feminist and a bank teller. Now, those who commit the conjunction fallacy answer the second, right? And this is what Kahneman and Tversky found is very common. People would often say that the second argument was inductively stronger. That it was more likely for Linda to be a feminist and a bank teller than for her to just be a bank teller. But the correct answer, of course, is the first argument, right? It has greater inductive probability than the second argument. It's more likely for Linda to be a bank teller than for her to be a feminist and a bank teller. And we can see the reason for this if we look at the truth table for and. So here I have a truth table with two arbitrary statements, P and Q, given in it, and then a column for their conjunction, P and Q. And if we look at where P and Q is true, we see that it's true only in the first row, whereas P taken individually is true in the first and second rows, and Q, as an individual statement, is true in the first and third rows. So both P and the individual statement Q are true in the row or the case where P and Q is, but they're also true in additional rows. In P's case, it's true in the second row. In Q's case, it's true in the third row. So if P and Q is true, then we know that both P is true and Q is true, right? So there should never be a case where we say it's more likely for P and Q to be true than for P to be true or for Q to be true. Right? But that's what we said in the case of the Linda problem, or that's what a lot of people said in the Linda problem, right? When they said that Linda is a feminist and a bank teller is more probable than Linda being a bank teller, they were saying that a conjunction, we'll say F and B, is more likely than just B, just one of its component conjuncts. And that can't be, because anytime anytime F and B is true, B is also true, but B can be true in cases when F and B is not true. The probability of B can be no less than the probability of F and B. Here's another case that doesn't have quite the apparent logical incoherence as the Linda problem. Still an interesting case of humans committing the conjunction fallacy in the sense of overestimating the probability of a conjunction. This is an example taken from the Eric Engner text. Though a Boeing 747-400, that's an airplane, has around 6 million parts. Suppose that each part is very reliable and only fails with probability 0.000001, so extremely unlikely. Assuming that failures are independent events, remember that means that the failure of any one part doesn't give evidence of the failure of any additional part. What is the probability that all parts work? Well, we can view that proposition, the proposition that all parts work, as a conjunction. It's a long conjunction, right? the first part works, and the second part works, and the third part works, so on, all the way through the 6 millionth part. Now, each of those individual conjuncts, that the first part works, the second part works, and so on, is extremely probable, right? Given how reliable the working of each part is. So we have a conjunction of very probable conjuncts. And then we ask people to estimate, what do you think the probability of the conjunction as a whole is, right? Now we'll see how we can formally do this, how we can figure out exactly what this probability is when we do probability theory in a couple weeks. Suffice it to say for now that if we cranked through the math, we would find the probability is only 0.25%, only 0.0025, that all of the parts will work. So this conjunction as a whole was pretty unlikely to be true. And people, when you ask them just for intuitive judgment here, they tend to significantly overestimate that probability. They'll give you a number much higher than 0.25 because the individual conjuncts are so likely. And they're not taking into account how low the probability of the conjunction can go, even when its individual conjuncts are very probable. All right. The flip side of the conjunction fallacy is what's called the disjunction fallacy. And this refers to the common tendency of humans to underestimate the likelihood of disjunctions, as or statements, especially relative to their component disjuncts. All right, so here we have a problem that's similar to the Linda problem that came from another paper by psychologists in the 1990s, we'll call the Oded problem. This gives us a description of a guy named Oded. Right? It says he did his military service as a combat pilot. He was a brilliant high school student whose teachers predicted for him an academic career. He is independent and original, diligent and honest. His hobbies are shortwave radio and astronomy. Right? And then we're asked, was he more likely to have studied physics or to have studied natural science? Okay, and here, right, the fact that he studied shortwave radio and astronomy, he was a combat pilot, he seems more like someone who might have studied physics than natural science, or at least that's the intuition a lot of people have. So we can again view this in terms of inductive probability of arguments. And we can think of the question as asking which of these two arguments has greater inductive probability. First argument, right, just starts with the information about Oded, which we can call O, and moves to the conclusion that he was a physics major. The second one starts with the information about Oded, which we can call O, and moves to the conclusion that he was a natural science major. Now, we could view natural science, for simplicity, as a disjunction between studying the physical sciences, or physics, and studying the biological sciences. So we can view it as P or B. So then we have one argument that moves to P, and one argument that moves to the P or B, a disjunction that has P as one of its disjuncts. Right? So if you commit the disjunction fallacy, you'll say the first argument is stronger. Right? It's more likely for him to be a physics major than to be a natural science major, right? Because that seems more salient to the description of Oded. But of course, the correct answer is that the second argument has to be stronger, right? It's more likely for him to be a natural science major than to be a physics major, right? And we can again see this through considering a truth table. In this case, we have a truth table for an or statement, P or Q. If we look at where P or Q is true, we see that's true in the first three rows, right? And in fact, if we look at an individual statement, say P, we see it's true in the first two rows. And in both the cases where it's true, P or Q is also true. But P or Q is also true in the additional third row. If we look at the statement Q, we say it's true that it's true in the first and third rows. And P or Q is also true in these two rows, but it's also true in the additional second row, right? So P or Q is true wherever P is true, and it's true wherever Q is true, right? So there's no way that P or Q could be less likely or less probable than P, or less likely than Q, right? Here's another example. So, right, let's be clear, right? That explain, right, this why the correct answer in this Oded problem is P or B, right? Because there's no way that it could be less likely for Oded to be a natural science major than a physics major, because if he was a physics major, he would still be a natural science major, whereas there's other ways to be a natural science major that don't involve being a physics major. Now, we could also think here of other examples where people might underestimate the probability of a disjunction that don't involve exactly that simple incoherence that we had in the Oded problem. So consider this example, also taken from the A in your text. Suppose we're asked to compute the probability of getting at least 1/6 when rolling a die 10 times. Okay, we'll see how we would compute this probability in a couple weeks. If we do, we get an answer of about 84%. Right. Now this is really asking us for the probability of a disjunction, right? Because we're asked, what's the probability that we'll get a 6 the first time, or a 6 the second time, or a 6 the third time, and so on up to the 10th time. Now each of the individual disjuncts here is pretty unlikely, right? It's only a 1 out of 6 chance on any particular roll that we get a 6, right? So we have a disjunction with fairly low probability for the disjuncts. And so people, when you ask them to intuitively give this probability, they tend to give a lower number than 84%. They tend to underestimate the probability of the disjunction, right? So this is sort of the reverse of what we had in the conjunction, the case of the conjunction fallacy, where people tend to overestimate the probability of a conjunction. They tend to underestimate the probability of a disjunction. Now, what could explain why we tend to commit these fallacies? Well, one possible explanation is what's known as the anchoring and adjustment heuristic, which was a heuristic proposed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. So you recall in the last video we talked about the representativeness heuristic. This is another heuristic, another rule of thumb that they proposed humans tend to use when making judgments. So how does the anchor and adjust heuristic work? Well, it works. It's a rule of thumb for coming up with any sort of numerical estimate. So coming up with a probability estimate would be a special case of this, right? So it says that to come up with a numerical estimate, what we first do is we fix upon an initial number that's in some way salient to us. That's our anchor. And then we move that estimate up or down as we see fit to come up with a final estimate, right? That's the adjustment stage of anchor and adjust. So let's see how this might work in an example that doesn't involve probability. So consider the 2004 Pixar film, The Incredibles, and suppose that we're asked to estimate the box office returns for this film. So we want to come up with a dollar amount that we think is how much The Incredibles earned at the US box office. Okay. Now, suppose that you were told beforehand, or somebody had mentioned to you, that the hit film Shrek 2 had earned $441 million at the US box office. If you were to do anchor and adjust to come up with an estimate for The Incredibles, what you might do is use that $441 million as an anchor, and then adjust up or down from that to come up with your estimate for how The Incredibles did, depending on whether you think it did worse or better than Shrek 2. So maybe you start with $441 million as your anchor, and then you think Incredibles was a little bit less popular, so you adjust down and come up with an estimate of $390 million. Okay. Now contrast that with if you were told, instead of Shrek 2 having been mentioned to you earlier, suppose that the box office returns for the Tom Hanks film The Polar Express were mentioned to you, and there the returns were $162 million, right? Much lower number. Maybe there, right, what you do if you were to apply anchor and adjust is you take that $162 million as your anchor, and then adjust up or down depending on how you think The Incredibles did relative to The Polar Express. So maybe you adjust up a bit there, and you wind up with a final estimate of $200 million. Right? In general, what's going to happen here, right, is that you're going to get lower or higher numbers depending upon what your initial anchor was, right? If your anchor was a much higher number, you'll tend to end up with a higher final estimate. If your anchor was a much lower number, you'll tend to end up with a much lower final estimate. And we can see an example like this. Anchor and adjust is not a terrible method to use here, right? Insofar as the box office returns of one film gives some evidence of the box office returns of another film. So it's not a terrible method to use here, but it can lead to some silliness in these cases of estimating the probabilities of conjuncts and disjuncts. And let's see how that would work, how we'd apply anchor and adjust to explain the conjunction fallacy. So let's take the Linda problem, right? We have this description that's given of Linda, that she's a social activist, and then we're asked what's more probable, that Linda is a bank teller or that Linda is a feminist and a bank teller. Well, what might be going on here, the reason we might end up viewing F and B, her being a feminist and a bank teller, as more likely than her being a bank teller, might be something like this, right? It might be that to estimate the probability of the conjunction F and B, we're anchoring on the probability of F, one of its disjuncts, or excuse me, one of its conjuncts, right? So we have F and B, one of its conjuncts is F, that she's a feminist, and we take that probability to be very high. Maybe it's like 80% or something. And then we adjust it down, right? Because we realize that, her being a feminist and a bank teller is less likely than her being a feminist. So to come up with the probability for her being a feminist and a bank teller, we adjust down from our anchor of maybe 80% for her being a feminist. We wind up with something, I don't know, maybe 10% or something. But when we're just estimating the probability of B directly, we lack a high anchor, right? And so we'll just come up with a lower number because we're not anchoring on a high number and then adjusting a little down from it. So we'll tend to end up with a lower number. We could use this similarly in the case with the disjunction fallacy, right, where we underestimate the probability of a disjunction, right? We look at we're anchoring on the probability of the lowest probability disjuncts, and then we're not sufficiently adjusting upward to account for the probability of the disjunction. So anchoring and adjust could be a heuristic that could explain why humans tend to commit the conjunction and disjunction fallacies. So what are our takeaways from this video? Well, first, right, we should realize that the weaker an argument's conclusion is, logically speaking, the greater the argument's inductive strength, right? So if you have an argument that concludes P, and then you have an argument that concludes some proposition that's logically weaker than P with the same premises, the second argument has to be a stronger argument than the first argument, right? If we were to put this in terms of epistemic probabilities or the probability of statements, we could say that the probability of a statement is never greater than the probability of a statement it entails. So the probability of a conjunction will never be more probable than the probability of its individual conjuncts. Or the probability of a proposition P will never be more than the probability of a disjunction of which P is a disjunct. Okay. Second takeaway is that humans have a tendency to overestimate the probability of long conjunctions, sometimes even short conjunctions, we saw in the case of Linda the bank teller, and to underestimate the probability of long disjunctions, sometimes even short disjunctions. And this should motivate us to want to not fully or completely or with full confidence rely on our instinctual probability judgments, but motivate us rather to develop that scientific inductive logic that we're building towards. So that's what we'll do next week. The next video, we'll look at base rate neglect or base rate fallacy, another systematic error that humans tend to make in making instinctual probability judgments. Please remember to complete the participation poll for this video, and thanks for watching.